The conference room felt suffocating, its beige walls closing in like a prison cell. 5 pairs of eyes stared across the polished oak table at the young man sitting opposite them, his light blue dress shirt already damp with sweat around the collar. The hiring committee's expressions ranged from polite interest to barely concealed irritation, their body language screaming discomfort. Tick, tick, tick. The sharp sound cut through the silence. Brad Cohen tried to maintain his composure, straightening his shoulders and clasping his hands together to prevent them from trembling. But his head jerked involuntarily to the right, a movement as natural as breathing, yet as unwelcome as a fire alarm in this sterile environment. The silver-haired woman on the committee frowned deeply, her expensive pen moving swiftly across her notepad in angry strokes. "Not suitable," she wrote in bold letters, underlining each word twice for emphasis. Another tick escaped his throat, louder this time, echoing off the bare walls like an accusation. The committee members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their collective judgment. Their discomfort was palpable, filling the room like thick smoke. "Excuse me, can you please control that?" The principal's voice carried the chill, his tone suggesting this interview was already over before it had truly begun. His steel-grey eyes regarded Brad with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for examining insects under a microscope. Brad took a deep breath, drawing on reserves of patience he'd built over years of similar encounters. That familiar, gentle smile spread across his face despite the mounting tension in the room, a smile that had survived countless rejections and would survive countless more. His voice remained steady, professional, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Sir, I have Tourette syndrome, but that doesn't prevent me from teaching effectively. It actually helps me understand students better than most educators ever could." The words came out clear and confident, each syllable carefully enunciated despite the chaos in his nervous system. The committee members exchanged glances again, their synchronized head shakes telling the story Brad had heard 24 times before. Their expressions shifted from uncomfortable tolerance to outright dismissal, like judges delivering a unanimous guilty verdict. The woman with the notepad actually rolled her eyes, not bothering to hide her disdain. He stood up slowly, adjusting his red striped tie with practiced dignity, and walked toward the door with that same unwavering smile. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, but he maintained his composure until the heavy oak door closed behind him with a decisive click that sounded like a gavel falling. In the hallway, Brad pulled out a small leather notebook from his vest pocket, its pages worn soft from constant handling. He crossed out another line of text with deliberate precision. Attempt number 25, rejected. The red ink seemed to mock him, but the next page remained blank, waiting patiently for opportunity number 26. The Atlanta traffic honked relentlessly outside as Brad Cohen sat in his aging Honda Civic, watching office workers hurry past on the sidewalk like ants with purpose. His grey vest was wrinkled after another long day of interviews, the fabric clinging uncomfortably to his skin in the Georgia humidity. The 24-year-old stared down at a yellowed piece of paper listing 127 schools across Georgia. 25 names now bore angry red crosses, each mark representing another door slammed shut in his face. His dreams of teaching seemed to shrink with every rejection, becoming smaller and more distant like stars fading at dawn. Tourette syndrome hadn't been Brad's choice. Since age 6, the involuntary tics and sudden vocal outbursts had become as much a part of his identity. The condition had shaped every interaction, every relationship, every moment of his existence. Elementary school had been a battlefield where classmates mocked his differences with the casual cruelty only children could master. Teachers automatically labeled him a problem child, who deliberately disrupted their carefully ordered classrooms, their minds already made up before giving him a chance to explain. The daily humiliation felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts. "Brad Cohen! Out of my classroom this instant!" The phrase echoed in his memory, a soundtrack of rejection that had played throughout his formative years, usually followed by a trip to the principal's office where he'd sit in confused silence, unable to explain why his brain made his body do things he couldn't control. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, while administrators lectured him about appropriate behavior. The isolation had been crushing, more painful than any physical injury he'd ever experienced. Lunch periods spent alone at corner tables while classmates whispered and pointed, recess time hiding in the library to avoid playground confrontations, walking home alone while other kids traveled in laughing groups. The loneliness had carved out a hollow space in his chest that never quite filled. Only Ellen Cohen, his single mother with her neatly braided brown hair and endless reservoir of patience, believed her son wasn't the difficult child everyone else saw. She worked double shifts as a nurse to support them both, coming home exhausted but always finding energy to listen to his troubles. Her unwavering faith in his potential had been the lighthouse guiding him through the darkest storms. She would sit beside his bed each night, gently stroking his hair while he cried from the day's accumulated pain. Her voice carried the warmth of hot chocolate on winter nights. "You'll find a way to turn your differences into strengths, sweetheart. I know you will." Those words became his anchor when the world felt determined to sweep him away. During those dark evenings when Brad felt completely alone in the world, Ellen would tell him stories about famous people who had been misunderstood by society. Mozart was considered strange and difficult too, you know, but look what he accomplished when someone finally believed in him. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who refused to let the world define her child's potential. The dream of becoming a teacher had crystallized during a single moment in 6th grade that changed everything. Mr. Jim Harper, a gentleman with silver hair and black-rimmed glasses, had done something no educator had ever done before. Instead of punishing Brad for his tics, he invited him to the front of the classroom to explain Tourette syndrome to his classmates. "Class, you see that Brad can't control these sounds any more than you can control your heartbeat?" Mr. Harper had explained, his kind eyes focused on Brad with genuine respect and encouragement. His brain works differently, and that's not something to fear or mock. It's something to understand and appreciate. The classroom fell silent, 30 pairs of eyes seeing Brad as a person rather than a problem for the first time. From that transformative day forward, Brad knew exactly what kind of adult he wanted to become. He would be the teacher he'd needed as a frightened, misunderstood child. He would create classrooms where differences were celebrated rather than condemned, where every student felt valued and understood. But America in the early 1990s wasn't ready for a teacher with Tourette syndrome. The disability rights movement was still fighting for basic accommodations, and educational institutions remained bastions of conformity. Each job application felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had been decided before he even spoke. The questions were always variations of the same theme. "Are you certain you're suited for this profession?" Or, "How do you expect students to concentrate with those interruptions?" The word interruptions was always delivered with distaste, as if his neurological condition was a personal failing rather than a medical reality. The navy blazer his mother had given him for graduation was beginning to show wear at the shoulders from countless interviews. The fabric had started to pill slightly, and the left sleeve showed faint stains from nervous sweating. He'd tried different ties, red stripes for luck, solid blue for professionalism, green with small dots for approachability, but none seemed to change the inevitable outcome. His collection of rejection letters was growing thicker than his folder of qualifications. Form letters mostly, thanking him for his interest while informing him they'd chosen to pursue other candidates whose qualifications more closely match our current needs. The polite language couldn't mask the underlying message, "You don't belong here." That evening, as Brad sat at his kitchen table preparing application number 26, he discovered an unopened envelope in his mailbox. Mountain View Elementary School, the only institution from his original list that hadn't responded to his initial inquiry. His hands trembled slightly as he read the return address, wondering if this might finally be the chance he'd been waiting for. Interview number 18 at Riverside Elementary had become a nightmare that haunted Brad's dreams weeks later. Principal Margaret Stevens drummed her manicured fingers impatiently on the conference table, each tap like a countdown timer measuring his dwindling chances. Her expression had grown more hostile with each passing minute, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She'd worn disapproval from the moment Brad had entered her office with its motivational posters and fake plants. Everything about the space screamed conformity and order. "Can you please stop making that noise?" Her voice cut through the air like broken glass, each word dripping with barely contained frustration. The principal's dark blazer seemed to inflate with indignation as she glared at him across the mahogany desk, her reading glasses reflecting the fluorescent lights like tiny shields. Tick, tick! Brad's body betrayed him again, the involuntary sound echoing in the silence like a gunshot. 3 other committee members sat along the walls like silent judges, their expressions ranging from pity to outright annoyance. One woman actually winced at the sound, as if Brad had physically struck her. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I apologize, but this is a natural neurological response that I cannot voluntarily control," Brad began, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the mounting humiliation. His voice remained steady even as sweat beaded on his forehead, years of practice helping him navigate these hostile waters. "Natural response?" Stevens interrupted, her voice rising an octave like a tea kettle reaching its boiling point. "Mr. Cohen, I have 25 children in my classrooms who are trying to learn fundamental skills that will determine their academic futures. How exactly do you expect them to focus on their education when their teacher is constantly making those sounds?" The way she said "those sounds" made it clear she viewed his condition as a character flaw rather than a medical reality. Her tone suggested he was being deliberately disruptive, choosing to make noise out of some perverse desire to cause problems. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Brad felt heat rushing to his face, his white dress shirt clinging uncomfortably to his skin like a damp shroud. "Ma'am, I've successfully tutored numerous children over the past 3 years, and my Tourette syndrome has never interfered with their learning progress. In fact, many parents have told me that my condition helped their children develop greater empathy and understanding of differences. Tutoring individual students is vastly different from managing an entire classroom environment, Mr. Cohen." Another committee member interjected, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a particularly slow child. Her voice dripped with condescension, treating him like a naive college student rather than a qualified educator. "We simply cannot risk compromising our students' educational experience for the sake of political correctness. Surely you understand our position and can appreciate the difficult choice we face." The words hit like physical blows, each phrase designed to make him feel guilty for even applying. The word hit Brad like a physical blow, lodging itself deep in his chest, as if his presence in a classroom posed some kind of danger to innocent children, as if his neurological condition was contagious or threatening rather than simply different. Interview 22 at Franklin Middle School proved even more devastating than Riverside. The principal barely allowed Brad to finish introducing himself before delivering his verdict with the cold efficiency of an executioner. The man's office was decorated with awards and certificates that seemed to mock Brad's aspirations. "We've made our decision," the man announced without looking up from his paperwork, his bald head reflecting the overhead lights. This position requires someone more stable. He pronounced the word stable as if it were a medical diagnosis, one that Brad clearly failed to meet by virtue of his neurological differences. The dismissal lasted less than 5 minutes, making it clear that Brad's qualifications, experience, and passion meant nothing compared to his disability. He was escorted out by a secretary who avoided eye contact, as if his condition might somehow transfer through casual interaction. That evening, Brad sat slumped at his small kitchen table, his grey t-shirt wrinkled from exhaustion and defeat. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like a vice. Ellen placed a steaming mug of coffee beside him, her worried eyes searching his face for signs of the confident son she'd raised to believe in himself. "Honey, maybe you should consider exploring other career paths," she suggested gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hate watching you go through this pain day after day. There are other ways to help children that might not involve so much heartbreak." The suggestion felt like a betrayal, even though he knew she meant well. Ellen had been his rock throughout this ordeal, but even she was beginning to doubt whether his dreams were achievable. Her words carried the weight of a mother who'd watched her child face rejection after rejection. Brad looked up sharply, his eyes red from holding back tears that threatened to spill over. "Do you think I'm not cut out for teaching either, Mum? Do you think they're right about me being unsuitable?" "That's not what I meant at all, sweetheart. But I can't bear seeing you hurt like this anymore. Maybe there's another way to help children that doesn't require jumping through these impossible hoops." Ellen's voice carried the anguish of someone watching a loved one suffer unnecessarily. That night, sleep eluded Brad completely as questions circled in his mind. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster while his laptop displayed article after article about disabled individuals in education. Every piece seemed to reach the same conclusion. Significant challenges ahead. Requires careful consideration. School environments demand stability and consistency. The research painted a bleak picture of systemic barriers and institutional prejudice that seemed insurmountable. Statistics showed that less than 2% of teachers had disclosed disabilities, and most of those involved invisible conditions. His visible, audible difference made him an anomaly in a profession that prized conformity. By dawn on Saturday morning, Brad stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his navy blue tie, the last one he hadn't worn to an interview. The reflection staring back at him looked older than his 24 years, worn down by months of rejection and self-doubt. Mountain View Elementary School represented opportunity 26 on his ever-growing list of potential employers. "If this doesn't work out," he whispered to his reflection, unable to finish the thought that threatened to shatter his remaining hope. The phone rang suddenly, startling him from his dark reverie like a fire alarm in the night. Ellen answered in the kitchen, her voice carrying down the hallway with unusual excitement. Something in her tone made Brad's heart skip a beat, hope flickering like a candle in the wind. "Brad, there's someone on the phone for you, honey." The voice on the other end belonged to a woman whose tone immediately set her apart from every other administrator he'd spoken with. Her words carried warmth instead of clinical detachment, interest instead of automatic rejection. The difference was so striking it took him a moment to process what she was saying. "Hello, Brad. This is Janet Wilson, principal at Mountain View Elementary. We received your application and would like to schedule an interview with you next week." Brad gripped the receiver tightly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. "Mrs. Wilson, I feel I should mention up front that I have Tourette syndrome, and many schools have found this to be—" "I know, Brad," she interrupted gently, her voice carrying understanding rather than judgment. "We'll discuss that when we meet in person. Can you come in next Tuesday at 2 o'clock? I'm looking forward to our conversation." When Brad hung up the phone, he stood frozen in disbelief. For the first time in 25 attempts, someone had said, "I know," instead of, "Thank you for informing us," followed by immediate rejection. The simple phrase carried more hope than he'd felt in months. Chapter 4. The Seed of Change. The Person Who Gave Him a Chance. Janet Wilson defied every expectation Brad had developed about school administrators during his months of fruitless interviews. She sat behind a modest oak desk, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a comfortable beige cardigan and khaki slacks that immediately put visitors at ease. Her warm brown eyes radiated genuine interest rather than the cold calculation Brad had grown accustomed to facing. "Tell me about your childhood, Brad," she began, completely bypassing the standard interview questions about experience and qualifications that had opened every previous conversation. The unexpected question caught Brad off guard after 25 interviews that had followed identical scripts focused on credentials and classroom management techniques. Tick, tick. The familiar sound escaped before he could prepare for it. Mrs. Wilson didn't flinch, didn't reach for a pen to make notes, didn't exchange meaningful glances with invisible committee members. She simply nodded encouragingly and said, "I'm listening." Brad found himself sharing stories he'd never told in a professional setting. The daily humiliation of being sent to the principal's office, the crushing loneliness of eating lunch alone while classmates whispered and pointed, the transformative moment when Mr. Harper had shown him what acceptance looked like. His voice trembled as he described nights spent crying himself to sleep, convinced he was destined to be society's burden rather than its contributor. "And that's when you decided to become a teacher," Mrs. Wilson observed quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Because I understand what it feels like to be abandoned by the system," Brad replied honestly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to become the person I needed when I was 7 years old and convinced I was broken beyond repair." Mrs. Wilson leaned back in her chair, studying Brad's face with an intensity that felt different from the scrutiny he'd endured elsewhere. "Brad, I have a second-grade classroom with 18 students. 3 of them struggle with learning disabilities, 2 have significant behavioral challenges, and 1 is on the autism spectrum. Do you believe you could help these children succeed?" Brad's heart began racing so fast he worried Mrs. Wilson might hear it across the desk. "Ma'am, I would be honored to—" "Let me be completely honest with you," she continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Some parents and faculty members will question my decision if I hire you. There will be doubts, whispered conversations, and possibly even formal complaints. But I believe these children need to see someone like themselves achieving success." The twist that followed would forever change Brad's understanding of why this interview felt different from all the others. "Do you want to know why I was willing to meet with you when 25 other schools weren't?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her eyes softening with personal pain. "My son Michael has ADHD. For 12 years of his education, not a single teacher truly understood him or saw his potential beyond his challenges. I refuse to let that happen to another child on my watch." Brad's first day in the classroom arrived with the weight of every dream he'd ever carried. He wore his light blue dress shirt and red striped tie, the lucky combination he'd saved throughout months of rejection. 18 pairs of curious eyes watched their new teacher with the mixture of excitement and skepticism that only 7-year-olds could manage. Tick-tick. The sound rang out across the quiet classroom like a bell. A blond boy in the front row immediately raised his hand. "Mr. Cohen, why do you make that noise?" "You make—" Brad smiled and knelt down to the children's eye level, a gesture that would become his trademark. "I have something called Tourette syndrome. It means my brain sometimes tells my body to do things I don't plan, like making that tick-tick sound or moving my head suddenly. It's kind of like how your heart beats without you having to tell it to." "Does it hurt?" asked a small girl in a flowered dress, her concern genuine and touching. "Not at all, sweetie. It's just how my brain works. Everyone's brain is a little different, and that's what makes each of us special." Tommy Rodriguez, a dark-haired boy sitting in the corner who'd been diagnosed with ADHD, suddenly blurted out, "You're like me. I can't sit still either." Brad's eyes lit up as he looked at Tommy, recognizing a kindred spirit immediately. "That's right, Tommy. We both have brains that work in special ways, and sometimes special brains can do amazing things that regular brains can't." From that moment, the classroom transformed into something magical. Brad turned each tick into a counting game, each head jerk into emphasis for important lessons. The children didn't fear differences anymore. They learned to celebrate them and support each other through challenges. Sarah Martinez, the quiet girl with mild autism, began speaking more confidently each day. "Mr. Cohen understands me," she told her mother one afternoon. "He's different like me, but he's happy about it." The week's end brought an email from Mrs. Wilson that made Brad's hands shake as he read it. "Brad, I've received 12 phone calls from parents this week. I'm afraid you need to prepare yourself for what's coming." Brad's heart sank as he prepared for the familiar sting of rejection, but the final sentence stopped him cold. "Every single parent called to thank me for giving their child the happiest week they've had at school all year." Month 2 revealed that getting hired had been merely the first step in Brad's uphill battle. The real challenge lay in proving he deserved to be there, not just to skeptical colleagues and administrators, but to the voice of doubt that whispered in his own mind during sleepless nights. Every morning at 5:30, Brad arrived at his empty classroom before the custodial staff had finished their rounds. His grey vest had been replaced by colourful cardigans, forest green for Monday motivation, bright orange for Tuesday energy, creating an atmosphere of warmth that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. He spent hours crafting lesson plans that transformed mathematics into treasure hunts and reading comprehension into detective mysteries, determined to prove that different didn't mean deficient. But not everyone welcomed his unconventional approach to education. During faculty meetings, his involuntary tics drew disapproving glances from veteran teachers who'd spent decades perfecting their quiet, orderly classrooms. Tick, tick, tick! The sound echoed through the conference room as Brad tried to focus on curriculum discussions. Patricia Campbell, a stern woman with 20 years of classroom experience and zero tolerance for disruption, whispered loudly enough for Brad to hear. "I simply don't understand how students can concentrate with that constant noise. It goes against everything we know about effective learning environments." Rather than defend himself or argue with his colleague, Brad chose the path his mother had taught him years earlier. "Don't waste energy trying to change minds, sweetheart. Focus on changing results." He continued taking notes, absorbing criticism with the same grace he'd shown during 25 failed interviews. The real test arrived in month 3, when standardized testing season loomed over the school like a storm cloud. Brad's classroom housed the highest percentage of students with learning differences in the entire building, and whispers began circulating about potential consequences if scores didn't meet expectations. "Teachers and administrators are worried about your class's performance," Mrs. Wilson explained during a private meeting, her usual warmth tempered by administrative reality. "If test scores fall short of district standards, the school board will inevitably question my hiring decision. Your future here depends on these results, but so does my credibility as a principal." The weight of responsibility nearly crushed Brad's spirit. This wasn't just about his career anymore. Mrs. Wilson had risked her professional reputation to give him this opportunity. That night, Brad spread 18 student files across his kitchen table like a battlefield general planning strategy. Each child represented a unique set of challenges. Tommy couldn't sit still for longer than 10 minutes without medication. Sarah's autism made traditional communication nearly impossible. Marcus struggled with reading comprehension that seemed to worsen under pressure. What are you working on so late, honey? Ellen appeared in her floral nightgown, concern etched across her tired features. I'm trying to figure out how to help these kids succeed, Mom. Brad replied, exhaustion evident in every word. If they fail these tests, it won't just mean I lose my job. These children will spend the rest of their academic careers believing they're as hopeless as everyone says they are. Ellen sat down beside her son, surveying the scattered paperwork with a mother's protective instinct. What do you need to make this work? Brad looked at the 18 files representing 18 futures hanging in the balance. I need a miracle. Miracles, Brad discovered, often came disguised as creativity and unconditional love rather than supernatural intervention. He transformed learning into adventure, turning mathematics into world-saving missions, where students solved equations to decode secret messages and prevent imaginary disasters. Reading comprehension became treasure-hunting expeditions, where each correct answer provided clues leading to golden rewards hidden throughout the classroom. For Tommy, Brad constructed a standing desk that allowed the boy to move freely during lessons without disturbing classmates. Motion helps your brain think better, Brad explained, normalizing what other teachers had labeled disruptive behavior. For Sarah, he developed a visual communication system using pictures and symbols that bypassed her verbal processing challenges. For Marcus, he broke down complex reading passages into smaller, illustrated segments that built confidence through incremental success. Mr. Cohen is different from other teachers, Tommy told his mother one evening after school. He never calls me bad or hyper. He says I'm energetic and creative, and those are good things to be. 3 weeks before testing began, a parent conference challenged everything Brad had accomplished. Robert Harrison, a software engineer and father of student Lucy, requested a meeting with Mrs. Wilson to voice concerns about his daughter's education. I'm worried about having Mr. Cohen teach my child, Mr. Harrison stated bluntly during their meeting. I've heard he has some kind of neurological condition that affects his behavior. Will this impact Lucy's academic progress, or create distractions that interfere with her learning? Mrs. Wilson invited Mr. Harrison to observe a typical day in Brad's classroom before making any final judgments about his teaching effectiveness. The observation day featured a lesson on fractions that Brad had spent weeks perfecting. He brought an actual pizza to class, cutting it into various pieces while students watched with rapt attention. Tick, tick. The familiar sound punctuated his explanation of mathematical concepts. Lucy Harrison sat in the front row, completely absorbed in counting pizza slices and calculating fractional relationships. She showed no signs of distraction or confusion despite her teacher's vocal tics. Mr. Cohen, Tommy's hand shot up with typical enthusiasm. You just ticked 3 times. That means we have 3/8 of pizza left. The entire class erupted in laughter, not at Brad's expense, but in shared joy at Tommy's mathematical breakthrough. Brad grinned widely. Exactly right, Tommy. My brain just helped you practice another fraction problem. Mr. Harrison sat in the back corner, witnessing something extraordinary. A teacher with Tourette syndrome and 18 difficult children learning together in an atmosphere of mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. Test results day arrived like Judgment Day, with Brad standing in Mrs. Wilson's office while she opened the sealed envelope containing his class's scores. Her expression remained carefully neutral as she scanned the numbers. Brad, I have good news and incredible news, she announced finally, allowing herself a small smile. The good news is that your class achieved the state average in all tested subjects. She paused dramatically, building suspense. The incredible news is that your students showed the highest improvement rates in the entire school district. 94% of your children improved by at least 2 grade levels in reading, and 89% exceeded expectations in mathematics. The end of Brad's first school year arrived with a formal graduation ceremony held in the packed auditorium, where he stood wearing his navy dress vest, the outfit he'd dreamed of wearing while watching his students succeed. 18 second graders sat in the front row, wearing miniature graduation caps, their faces glowing with pride and accomplishment that seemed impossible just 9 months earlier. Tommy sat perfectly still for 45 minutes straight, setting a personal record that would have seemed impossible in September. Sarah had confidently read a poem aloud to the entire auditorium, her voice clear and strong, despite her autism spectrum challenges. Marcus had written a complete essay about his special teacher that brought tears to several parents' eyes when Mrs. Wilson read it during the ceremony. "And now," Mrs. Wilson announced into the microphone, "I'd like to introduce a teacher who has fundamentally changed our understanding of what special truly means in education." When Brad walked to the podium, his characteristic tick-tick sound echoed through the sound system. Instead of uncomfortable silence or embarrassed shifting, the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause that lasted nearly 2 full minutes. 1 year ago, I sat through 25 job interviews where I heard the word unsuitable more times than I care to remember. Brad began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Today I stand before you not to celebrate my own success, but to honor these incredible students who taught me that different isn't a limitation. It's a doorway to deeper understanding and authentic connection." In the audience, Robert Harrison sat beside his wife, his eyes damp with tears he hadn't expected to shed. The week before, he'd hand-delivered a letter of apology to Brad's classroom. "I was wrong to judge you based on misconceptions and fear. Lucy tells me every day that Mr. Cohen is the best teacher in the world, and I believe her completely now." Patricia Campbell, the veteran teacher who'd initially questioned Brad's classroom management abilities, occupied a seat in the second row. She'd visited Brad's office the previous Tuesday with words that still echoed in his memory. "I owe you an apology. You accomplished something I never could in 20 years of teaching. You turned students everyone labeled unteachable into the most successful class in our school's history. These children taught me that education isn't about making every student identical." Brad continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Education is about helping each child become the very best version of themselves, celebrating their unique strengths while supporting them through their individual challenges." After the ceremony ended and families had departed, Brad sat alone in his quiet classroom, surrounded by thank you cards and letters from students and parents. He opened one envelope from Tommy that made him laugh through his tears of joy. "Dear Mr. Cohen, thank you for never telling me to sit down and be quiet. You taught me that being different is actually awesome. I counted your ticks today during the ceremony. 137 times. That's a new record. I'll miss you this summer. Love, Tommy. P.S. My mom says I can be a teacher too when I grow up, even with ADHD." The classroom phone rang suddenly, interrupting Brad's reflective moment. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, principal of Roosevelt Elementary across town. "Mr. Cohen, I've heard remarkable things about your work with special needs students. We have an inclusion program that desperately needs someone with your unique understanding and proven track record. Would you be interested in expanding your impact to help even more children who need advocates like you?" Brad looked out his classroom window, where Ellen waited in her car, pride radiating from her smile as she waved enthusiastically. The woman who'd believed in him when the entire world seemed determined to prove her wrong. When he hung up the phone and prepared to leave, Brad noticed the message board where his students had written their final thoughts about the school year. In colorful chalk, 18 different handwriting styles had collaborated on one powerful message. "Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for teaching us that different is beautiful and special is strong." He pulled out the small leather notebook that had traveled with him through 25 rejections and one life-changing acceptance. On the final page, he'd originally written, Attempt 26. Accepted. Valued. Trusted. But now he crossed out those words and wrote something better. Attempt 26. Became a teacher. Changed lives. Found purpose. 2 years later, Mountain View Elementary had become the state's model school for inclusive education, hosting visitors from districts across the country who wanted to learn about their revolutionary approach to serving students with diverse needs. Brad wasn't just a teacher anymore. He'd become a symbol of how different could transform into exceptional when given the right opportunity and support. And in a small classroom 200 miles away, a young teacher named Jennifer Martinez opened her first acceptance letter after months of rejection. She had mild cerebral palsy and had been told repeatedly that her physical limitations made her unsuitable for classroom work. On her desk lay a newspaper article about Brad Cohen with the headline, "The Teacher Who Defied 25 Rejections to Inspire Thousands." The story was spreading, one transformed life at a time, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single person who refuses to accept that different means less than. The revolution of acceptance and inclusion had found its voice, and it spoke with the unmistakable sound of hope overcoming prejudice.